Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
I am speaking about whether morality is natural. You know, once upon a time, it was possible for a speaker to say, and possible to expect that everyone would agree, that the moral basics, the foundational principles of morality, are the same for everyone. I mean the same for everyone in two different senses. In the first place, I mean that the moral basics are right for everyone. In other words, deliberately taking innocent human life, sleeping with my neighbor's wife, mocking God are as wrong for me as they are for you, no matter what either one of us believes. In the second place, I mean that at some level, everyone knows these moral basics. They're the same for everyone, not only as to rightness, but as to knowledge. Even the murderer knows the wrong of murderer. The mocker knows the wrong of mockery. The adulterer knows the wrong of adultery. On this traditional view, we may fancy ourselves moral skeptics sometimes, but there are no real moral skeptics, not as to the basics. Supposed skeptics are playing make-believe and doing it badly. They're pretending not to know what they really do. Now, just so that you don't think that I'm being arrogant and self-righteous there, I should say that I have been in that condition for a good portion of my life. And I'm speaking partly from the experience or the inside knowledge that came from being in it and having gotten out of it. Paradoxically, though, maddeningly, isn't it true, that we appeal to the principles of right and wrong, even in order to justify our wrongdoing? The murderer doesn't normally declare how right it is to deliberately take innocent human life. What he says is something like, it wasn't deliberate. See, I didn't have a choice. He wasn't innocent. See, he took the job that should have gone to me. Or maybe he says, that vermin, he wasn't human. Or he didn't have a life. The student who cheats on the test doesn't normally declare how good it is to cheat. What he says is, well, you know, I wasn't really cheating because I had the knowledge and I just couldn't remember it. Or he says, maybe I did cheat, but it wasn't very wrong because it would have been even worse to flunk. So you see, I really had to do it. Rationalization, making excuses, is the homage paid by guilt to moral knowledge. As I say, once upon a time, a speaker who expressed such views could expect nearly everyone to agree. And nearly everyone did. The Christians agreed, the Jews agreed, the Muslims agreed. Moreover, they could call to their support the consensus of the rest of the human race. By and large, the pagans agreed. One might search the wide world, not the wild world, it is pretty wild too, but I meant to say the wide world over for people who didn't know the moral basics, but one would fail. Don't get me wrong, the wide world over people also carved out excuses for themselves. I was just talking about that a moment ago. I must not take innocent human life, they said, but only my tribe is human. I must not sleep with my neighbor's wife, but I can make my neighbor's wife mine. I must not mock deity, but I can ascribe deity to a created thing instead of to the creator. And so not only was moral knowledge universal, but the determination to play tricks on moral knowledge was universal too. And that is a problem. There aren't just, sometimes people say, are there moral universals? If only there was just one universal, but there are two. There's some universal knowledge of right and wrong, and there's a universal determination to play tricks on it. You see, a law is written on the heart of man, but it's everywhere entangled with the evasions and subterfuges of men. And even so, that law endured, and even so, it was seen to endure. Now, today, all that has changed. A speaker like me, who expresses such views, can no longer expect most people to agree. In fact, he has to expect most people to disagree. He'll be told that the foundational moral principles are plainly not the same for everyone, Probably not right for everyone, certainly not deep down known to everyone. That's what he'll be told. For example, he'll be asked, don't we disagree profoundly about all three of the big ticket items that I mentioned a minute ago about death, sex, and God? Consider death. An entire generation has now come of age, taking for granted the liberty to kill one's own children in the dim, soft refuge which was once considered the safest of all, the womb. The latest social movements seek to extend this strange liberty to other sorts of killing. Once upon a time, it was thought that the smallest, the weakest, and the most helpless had the greatest claim on our protection, but now it's held that they have the least. Most medical schools have rewritten the Hippocratic Oath. Did you know that? In order to accommodate the view that a physician may be a killer as well as a healer. Medical ethics journals, I came across a new instance of this just last month and shared it with my own students. Medical ethics journals routinely publish articles in defense of such things as infanticide. Now, does that make morality just something that we invent so that we can invent a different morality if we want to? Well, that's been tried. And you know it doesn't work. Consider the moral principle that it's wrong to deliberately take innocent human life. The Nazis systematically took innocent human life, didn't they? 6 million Jews, a roughly equal number of other people. If anyone could be said to have invented a new and different morality, well, then they could have. A morality in which it's all right to deliberately take innocent human life. I said if anyone could be said to have invented a new morality. But did they actually succeed? Did they actually succeed in inventing a new one? No. The old morality dogged them. Not even the Nazis could turn wrong into right in the first place in order to carry out the killings. They had to convince themselves somehow that the wholesale extermination of Jews wasn't deliberately taking innocent human life. The Nazi propaganda theme of the Untermensch, the underman, played into this theme by contending that the Jews were either less than human or less than innocent or both. It was a lie, of course, but they had to try to convince them of this because even they could not forget the wrong of deliberately taking innocent human life. One SS pamphlet contended, I quote, "From a biological point of view, he seems completely normal. He has hands and feet and a sort of brain, but in fact, he is a completely different creature, a horror. He only looks human." That's what they told themselves. Nazis dehumanized Jews in... do we have a flashlight? Nazis dehumanized... I was wondering if I was going to have to do this whole talk from memory. That would have been an interesting experiment. They dehumanized Jews in other ways too. For example, by herding them naked from the train disembarkation platform to the barracks so that they would seem not like people, but like cattle to the prison guards. A journalist named Gitta Sereni asked Franz Stangl, who was the former commandant of the Treblinka death camp, if they were going to kill them anyway. What was the point of all the humiliation, all the cruelty? You know what he replied? He said, it was to condition those who actually had to carry out the policies to make it possible for them to do what they did. So in the first place, I'm saying, even they could not invent a new morality. They had to convince themselves that they were not violating the norm against the deliberate taking of innocent human life by trying to convince themselves that this life wasn't innocent and wasn't human. In the second place, all those Nazi efforts to convince themselves that slaughtering Jews wasn't the deliberate taking of innocent human life failed terribly. Guilty knowledge was an overwhelming burden for most of the exterminators. Robert J. Lifton, who is a psychologist who wrote a book about this, reports on an interview with a former Wehrmacht neuropsychiatrist who had treated large numbers of death camp soldiers for psychological disorders. And what Lifton found, speaking to the neuropsychiatrist, was that the neuropsychiatrist had found that their symptoms were much like those of combat troops, these death camp guards, much like those of combat troops, but they were more severe and lasted longer. They had the hardest time, it turned out, shooting women and children, especially children. And many of them had nightmares of punishment or retribution. Now, allow me to point out the obvious, may I? People with untroubled consciences do not have dreams of being accused by their victims. Now, some people agree with me that we can't invent a different morality, but they still say morality is arbitrary. They say, well, okay, we human beings can't make morality different than it is, but morality could have been different than it is. There are two common ways to make this argument. One of them is most often proposed by secular people. The other is most often proposed by religious people. Both of these arguments make morality arbitrary, and I think both of them are wrong. Let's begin with the secular argument. According to this line of reasoning, morality is something like an instinct. Okay, haven't you heard that? As a matter of fact, when people hear that I teach about the natural moral law, they say, oh, the natural moral law. I know what you mean. It's about instincts, right? Conscience is just an instinct, huh? Something that we have only because it had adaptive value for our remote primate ancestors. This line of reasoning says, somehow or other, it helped them to pass on their genes to their descendants. And if this is true, then it makes morality arbitrary, because on this line of reasoning, if our evolutionary history had been different, then we might have developed with different instincts than we do have. For example, instead of taking care of our young, as we primates do, we might have turned out like guppies who eat them. And in that case, presumably, we would have had guppy consciences, guppy ethics, guppy morality. We'd consider it good and not evil to eat our young, provided that they aren't fast enough to get away when we're hungry. I'm glad we didn't come out like that, you might say. But guppies, if they could reason, might say they were glad that they didn't come out like us, if this line of reasoning is true. How repulsive, they might be thinking, intelligent guppies, to care for your children instead of to eat them. According to this line of reasoning, neither side would be right, and neither side would be wrong. Moral approval and moral disapproval on this line of reasoning makes sense only from within, from the inside of a particular morality. That is just how guppies are. This is just how we primates are. Man is the result of a meaningless and purposeless process that did not have us in mind. I'll give you an example of someone who buys this argument. There's a fellow named George E. Delury. Delury gave his wife a lethal dose of pills. After she lost consciousness, he put a plastic bag over her head and he suffocated her. He was convicted of murdering her after serving time in prison. He wrote a book called But What If She Wants to Die? I've read the book. I was asked by a magazine once to review it. It was a very strange read, but it was illuminating in its own weird way. Delury admits, denies, and dismisses his remorse all at the same time. Immediately after committing the murder, he says that for months afterward, he was haunted by a deep, powerful sense of guilt. But rather than calling this sense of guilt the voice of an objective moral law, he says it was, quote, primitive and, quote, irrational. He says that it was merely, I'm not going to keep saying quote unquote, but a lot of this is quotation. He said that it was merely a dissonance that resulted from his having overcome an inherited primate inhibition against killing our own kind. The dissonance of a primate over the violation of a fundamental instinct, he said. That's interesting. Here's why I think that argument is wrong. Conscience must be more than an instinct. I'm not saying that there's no biological basis for any of these kinds of things. We are embodied beings. There are material parts to us, and there are immaterial parts to us. The non-material parts are good, and the material parts are good. We got genes, sure. But I think that there's something more to this than just instinct. Conscience must be more than an instinct because conscience sometimes tells us to act against our instincts. I may have an instinct to kill a man who's competing with me for something we both want badly. Yet conscience warns me that it would be wrong to do so. I may have an instinct to run away from danger. Yet conscience bids me to stand fast and defend my friends. Someone might try to answer me by saying, well, Professor Budziszewski, in cases like this, conscience is merely the strongest instinct. That's all. But you know, that answer doesn't work either. Because in some cases, two instincts are in conflict. One of them is stronger, but the one that conscience tells me to follow is the weaker one. Now, why should that... Technology failure 2. Okay, am I too loud?
No.
Good? All right. Now, why should that ever happen? Why should evolution have followed such a tortuous and circuitous path, allowing me to have conflicting impulses, but also giving me a third thing that says, ignore that one, follow this one? If the third thing is just another instinct, then what gives it its authority? On what authority, by what authority could this third instinct pass judgment between those two instincts? That which passes judgment on instincts must be something different than an instinct. Notice, too, that we experience the violation of conscience differently than we experience the violation of an instinctual urge. Violation of an instinctual urge, I want to drink, I want to eat, I want to whatever, leads merely to frustration or disappointment. But violation of conscience leads to a sense of trespass, of breach, of transgression. The good that I betrayed wasn't merely something commended to me by inclination, but commanded by authority. I find myself not just dismayed, but accused. I have violated what I recognize as a real law. Well, I conclude from this that man is not the mere result of a meaningless and purposeless process that did not have him in mind. I believe that we are intended, that however long it took, by whatever process it was used, someone made us. And that the reason that a well-formed conscience speaks to us with authority is that this authority is his. Morality comes from God. Well, now at this point, you remember I said that this version of the argument had both this second argument had both a religious version and a secular version. Let me give you the religious version, because at this point some religious people make an argument that I think is just as mistaken as the secular argument that we've just been talking about. At first it sounds like they're agreeing with me, because you're right, they say, morality is the command of God, and whatever he says goes, and there's no other reason why anything is right or wrong, and he can command anything he wants. Now the problem with that argument is that it makes morality just as arbitrary as the other two views make it. The view that says that morality is just something we invent, that was the first one we considered, you remember, makes morality arbitrary because in that case, Well, we could make up whatever we want. We could invent a different morality. The view that says morality is the instinctual outcome of a process that did not have us in mind makes morality arbitrary because that in that case, the process might have ended up differently. But the view that says that God can command anything whatsoever makes morality arbitrary too. In fact, it makes him arbitrary because in that case, he could have commanded something altogether different than he is. He could have said, instead of love your neighbor, hate your neighbor. Instead of love me, hate me. Instead of honor your parents, kill your parents. I don't want to be misunderstood here. Someone might say this. Someone might say, oh, I get it. You think the reason God can't command anything contrary to the good is that the good is higher than God and limits him. Well, now that's not what I think at all. I deny that God is higher than the good because that makes the good arbitrary. But I also deny that the good is higher than God because if anything is higher than God, then he isn't God, it is. The solution, I think, is that God and the good turn out to be the same thing. God and his goodness are identical. God is goodness, not an abstraction. Goodness himself, in person. The reason he cannot command evil is that he cannot command what is contrary to his own being. Another way that some religious people misunderstand all this is by thinking that the only way that you can know what God commands is to read the Bible. This is beginning to bring me back to why this is a talk about natural law. Since I dissed the morality as an instinct view, you might have said, well, he doesn't think morality is natural. No, I think it is, but not in that sense. It's not true that the only way that you can know what God commands is to read the Bible. I'm sorry, but civilizations all over the world, civilizations that have never heard of the Bible, have figured out the basics of God's moral expectations for us. I don't say that they've lived up to them. We don't live up to them either, do we? I only say that at some level they know them. You don't have to read the Bible to know that you should honor your parents. You don't have to read the Bible to know that you should take care of your children. You don't need to read the Bible to know that you should not steal, not murder, and not lie. The funny thing about the view that the only way to learn right and wrong is to read the Bible is that this view isn't even biblical. You would think that the Bible, if the only way to know right and wrong is to read the Bible would say the only way to know right and wrong is to read me. It doesn't say that. In fact, it says just the opposite. In a famous passage, St. Paul says, and this is in his letter to the young church at Rome, he says that when the Gentiles, who have never heard of the biblical moral law, do what the law commands, they show that the law is written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness. He didn't mean that what people think about the details of right and wrong is always correct. We're talking about the basics here. What he meant is that if we say we don't have a clue, we're lying to ourselves. We do have a clue. In fact, we've got lots of clues. They are built into the way that we were created. These clues, they were woven right into human nature, these clues, right into our core, right into what he calls our heart. Built into human nature? But professor, aren't you committing the famous naturalist fallacy? Aren't you saying that an is can imply an ought? And haven't we all been told that that isn't true? Well, I'm saying that an is can imply an ought, but it isn't a fallacy, and it has been a long time since most philosophers have thought that it is. You can derive evaluative conclusions in certain ways from certain kinds of descriptive statements. For instance, the purpose of the eyes is to see. That's a descriptive statement. Seeing is what they're for. But it implies that eyes that see poorly are bad ones, and eyes that see well are good ones. And that's an evaluative conclusion. Since good should be done and brought about, it also follows that the right thing to do with bad eyes, eyes that see poorly, is to try to make them into better eyes, to help them be eyes that can see well. Suppose your ophthalmologist didn't think so. Suppose he said, well, no, you're going blind. But I wouldn't say that that's a bad or an unfortunate thing, because I wouldn't want to commit the naturalist fallacy. you'd think him a fool. And rightly so. Well, now let me return to my story. I said that how we need to live is built right into the way that we were created, woven right into human nature. That's why what I'm talking about is called the natural moral law. Natural doesn't mean unrelated to God. He is the author of our nature. But it is built into our nature. The moral principles that flow from these clues built into us have traditionally been called the natural law. People, they used to know about the natural law. It was the spine of Western ethics and jurisprudence. Did you know that? Usually when like on the airplane today, I was coming out here, somebody says, oh, I'm going to do such and such. My seatmate was meeting with an alumni committee about something. Said, what are you doing? I'm going, I said, I'm going and I'm going to give a lecture about natural law to some folks at the university. And I had to explain what natural law is. Now, she was a very intelligent woman, and I'm not in the least being critical of her, but she didn't know what it was. When I explained, she understood. People don't know anymore. We're not taught. That's very surprising. 2 centuries ago, you wouldn't have found anybody who didn't know what the natural law is. Everybody knew what the natural law is. When the American founders said in the Declaration of Independence that the justice of their cause was rooted in the laws of nature and nature's God, people knew what they were talking about. That's why they said it. Today, that's no longer the case. Most people have never heard of the natural law, but we have the same human nature as we ever did. The same clues as to how we need to live are still built into us. They are still right under our noses. You don't know the natural law, or it isn't the case that there is a natural law because some philosopher wrote a book about it, although books need to be written about it. It is built into us. So if I'm talking about these clues, you might be getting impatient at this point. You say, you keep talking about these clues built into us. Aren't you going to tell us what they are? Well, there are 4 of them. I usually call them the 4 witnesses. But since I've been describing them as clues, tonight I'm going to break with my own custom, and I'm going to call them the 4 clues. All right? The first clue is deep conscience. The second is the orderliness of our nature, its sheer designedness. The third clue is the actual details of that design. And the fourth clue is the natural consequences of doing wrong. I'm going to come back to each one of them. All 4 of them, though, have to do with the structure of human nature, with how human persons have been made by the Creator. Now, the fascinating thing about the first clue, deep conscience, is that we are forced to use our moral knowledge, even in order to pretend not to know our moral knowledge. Consider the knowledge of the wrong of stealing from our neighbors. I may tell myself that taking from a rich man isn't stealing because he shouldn't have more than I have in the first place. He's the real thief, I say. He's part of that 2%, I guess. I'm just rectifying the balance. The 2% thing is contemporary. We used to say something like that in my college dorm. There was a trick. I can tell you what this trick is because it can't be done anymore. It's not technologically possible anymore because the telephone companies changed their instruments. And who uses pay telephones anymore anyway? Have you ever heard of pay telephones? They were these things, you put coins in them, and you got to make a call. They were attached to cords. You couldn't carry them around. Well, in my dorm, what everybody learned on his first day in the dorm was that you could make a free telephone call. You unfolded a paper clip and you poked it through the speaker part of the telephone. There used to be this thing that had a part for your ear and a part. You poked it through there and made electrical contact, and then you touched the other end of the paper clip to a metal plate that was on the front of the device. Bing! You had a dial tone. Didn't have to drop the coin in. Well, one fellow told me, he was a socialist. He said this isn't really stealing, because the telephone company is ripping off the masses. And so we're just ripping off the rippers off. All right? All right. Now, you see, the interesting thing about that is that even in order to justify stealing, he had to appeal to the principle of the wrong of stealing. He had to make use of the principle even to justify his violation of the principle. You find paradoxes like that going on whenever people justify what they're doing wrong. It's the same thing with the example that I started with. The fellow says stealing from a rich man is a stealing because he shouldn't have more than I have in the first place. It's unjust. Well, the person is appealing to a true moral principle. Justice should be done. But the problem is that he's using that true moral principle to beat down the awareness of another true principle, the wrong of theft. And he can only beat it down. He can't destroy it. You can push knowledge down, but it's like a wildcat. It's still there. Have you ever tried to push down even a house cat, even a pussy cat? Make it lie down when it doesn't want to? It's likely to scratch you, right? Your moral knowledge will do that too. When you are in denial, you can only suppress your knowledge. You can't destroy it. That's the first clue, deep conscience. The second clue, the fascinating thing about the second clue, the orderliness of human nature, its sheer designedness, is that deep down everybody recognizes this designedness. Consider what St. Paul says in Romans 1. You don't have to take this as divine revelation if I do, but you don't have to take it as divine revelation if you don't want to. Just take it as an observation by a very wise man. You might think that the apostle would have complained, oh, those pagans. They ought to know about God, but they don't. Instead, he complains something entirely different. He says those pagans, they do know about God, but they pretend to themselves that they don't. He says that the truth about God has been known to people, human beings in general, from the beginning, from observing what God has made, from the evidence of the creation. We spontaneously recognize the Creator. But he says in one translation, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, which means they hold it down. They tell themselves that they don't know what they really do. Now, the fascinating thing about the third clue, and by the way, recognition of designedness has moral consequences. You might think, what does this have to do with moral law? You know there's a God, so what? Well, then you know that you are in debt, big. You owe your very being to somebody. From conscience, you know that when you owe somebody, you know that when somebody has done something really good for you, you owe big time. Okay? So the fact that we owe our very being to another has moral consequences. The fascinating thing about the third clue, I said the third clue wasn't just the fact of our orderliness, our design, but it's the details of that design. The fascinating thing about that clue is how skillful we are in ignoring those details. Consider just one of them, the complementarity of the sexes. It's really pretty obvious that we come in two kinds, isn't it? It's really pretty obvious that they're not the same. And it's not really very difficult to recognize that the world is a sweeter and a better place because of it. There are more colors in the rainbow of human experience because there are two kinds of us. We complement each other. We balance each other in ways that we really need. Men are, in certain ways, incomplete. Their girlfriends know it. Women, don't you know it? And we really need women. Women are less likely to get certain things that come more easily to men too. We need each other. Now, this is one of the most obvious things about us, and yet isn't it true that in our day it is one of the most frequently overlooked and even denied? Isn't that true? As a matter of fact, if you say it, don't people get angry at you? And say, you must believe in inequality or something, you chauvinist pig. But I think that we ignore such facts at our peril. The fact that there is something missing from the makeup of a man which can be found only in the woman. Something which is missing from the makeup of a woman which can be found only in the man. We ignore these facts at our peril. Any way of life that denies the complementarity of the sexes, or any of the other fundamentals of our design, that's just an example, is asking for trouble. That expression that I just used, asking for trouble, points to the fourth and final clue, which is the natural consequences of wrongdoing. Borrowing from a remark, again, in Paul's letter to another group of Christians, the Galatians. Another name for this fourth clue might be the law of the harvest. Many of the consequences of wrongdoing kick in even during the present life. You really do reap what you sow. He who cuts himself bleeds. He who cheats his friends loses his friends. He who indulges in heroin becomes its slave. He who abandons his children when they're young has no one to stroke his brow and comfort him when he's old and in need of care and comfort. He who jumps from bed to bed to bed loses the very capacity for romantic intimacy and trust, eventually. We see that the ancient principle that God is not mocked, that whatever a man sows, he also reaps, is sown into the very fabric of experience. Lives that go with the grain of our created nature tend to prosper. Lives that go against it suffer loss, even by their own reckoning of loss. Amazingly, even the attempt to escape from the natural consequences of our deeds has natural consequences. Sometimes the effort to escape from the consequences may shift those consequences onto others, for example, onto our children. Many of you know what I'm talking about. My generation invented the sexual revolution. Sexual revelation, well, that's what we all thought it was. My generation invented the sexual revolution, but your generation is paying most of the price. We succeeded in pushing the costs of it onto you. And a lot of you know what I'm talking about. It's not easy growing up without a dad, for example. Because everybody says, I have to pursue my own fulfillment, don't I? Now, although there are all sorts of ways to shift natural consequences onto others, nothing can make them go away. And it gets worse. I've referred to physical consequences of wrongdoing like addiction. I've referred to social consequences of wrongdoing like fatherlessness. But there are also noetic consequences. That adjective comes from the Greek word noesis. It means knowledge. There are consequences in knowledge. By noetic consequences of wrongdoing, I mean things that happen in our moral knowledge because violated conscience takes revenge. This is a true story. It's from the mouth of a counselor. A woman aborted her first child to punish her unfaithful husband. It was while she was pregnant that she discovered that he'd been unfaithful to her. You can imagine how she felt. She was humiliated. She felt violated. She was traumatized. And she was enraged. He wanted the child. So to punish him, she had an abortion. That's not when she went to see the counselor. She went to see the counselor after she'd aborted her second child. Now, why did she abort her second child? The counselor asked her. I didn't ask the counselor who told me the story. I didn't ask her what she thought the woman's answer was going to be. I can imagine what I might have thought. I might have thought, well, maybe she was still angry at her husband. That wasn't it. No, she didn't want to punish her husband again. This time, she wanted to punish herself. The worst thing that she had ever experienced was her remorse. But she felt that it wasn't enough. The one thing that could increase her remorse was to repeat the sin. As she explained it to her counselor, the reason that she had her second abortion was simply this, quote, I wanted to be able to hate myself more for what I did to the first baby. I think that's tragic. I wanted to be able to hate myself more for what I did to the first baby, so I killed the second one too. My God, what do we do to ourselves? And why? Sometimes people think that if the natural law really were built into us, as I've said it is, deep conscience, the recognition of our designedness, our orderliness, the details of that design, the witness of natural consequences. Some people think that if the natural law really were built into us, it would be like an automatic switch. We wouldn't be able to violate it. The truth is more like this. The natural law really is built into us, and that's why, when we do violate it, we give ourselves so much pain. It really is built into us, and that's why, when we pretend to ourselves that we haven't violated it, we give ourselves even more pain. By dishonoring it, we are desecrating ourselves. And yet, there is an awful lot there to desecrate, because we are made in God's image. Now, I said earlier that you don't need to read the Bible to know the moral basics, because they're built into us. Remember that? Some of the Christians who sponsored this event, this talk, might have been upset when I said that. I don't know. Sometimes that happens if I give a talk like this, and I say, you don't need to read the Bible to know the moral basics. They say, yes, you do. You don't. Come on, you're working against us here. Because they may have thought that I was saying that the Bible is superfluous, that it's unnecessary. Well, I don't think that the Bible is superfluous, so let me tell you what I think it's for. I don't think that we receive the Word of God because we wouldn't have had a clue about how to behave otherwise. God built those clues into us. The Bible itself, when it speaks of right and wrong, wouldn't be plausible to us if we didn't have those clues to go by, saying, yes, that rings true. The Bible isn't the only source of knowledge about right and wrong. In that respect, it only echoes, reinforces, clarifies, and uplifts what God has already made known to us by other means. By how we are made. Dimly known to us, perhaps, but known. If we didn't already know something about right and wrong, then what the Bible said about the matter wouldn't even be plausible to us. What the Bible does tell us, though, is this. It tells us what we can do about the fact that we fail to live up to what we know about right and wrong. It tells us what we can do about the suffering that we endure because of this failure. Now, the name for that topic is redemption. It refers to forgiveness. It refers to grace. It refers to healing. It isn't my topic for this evening, so I'm going to say nothing more about it. That shocked you, didn't it? But it's far more important than what I have taken as my topic. So I hope perhaps I've given you reason to look into it. We weren't made for pain. We were made for joy. Thank you.
So we've got time for questions now. And if you have a question for Professor Budziszewski, I'd like to invite you to come on down here. We've got a microphone. I think the idea is to allow everybody to hear your questions. So you can come and use this microphone. And so I'll invite you to come now. And I'm told I get the first question. So I'll throw a quick question your way. So I work in bioethics, and among the many innovative proposals that are sort of on the table in the biotechnological revolution we're going through is that maybe we could change our nature. So for instance, to try to connect to something you mentioned in your talk tonight, what if there were a drug that we could take that would alter our moral capacity with respect to, say, a feeling of guilt? And I just wonder if the ethics is grounded in human nature, then what happens if we propose to change that nature?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it's one I've actually written about in my and investigated. I think it deserves a lot more investigation than I've given it in my own writing about natural law. I think one of the principles of the natural law is that since our nature was given to us by another, it was a gift. We shouldn't go monkeying with ourselves, and I don't think that we can change our nature. A nature is not a mechanism, you know? You can remove a gear from a mechanism and put in a different gear. You can change it because you made it. We're not mechanisms, okay? We are, well, the philosophical term is substances. I think we can ruin our nature. We can destroy ourselves. We might be able to turn ourselves into mechanisms and abolish our humanity and essentially wipe out the human race, imagining that we were uplifting it or transhumanizing it. But we can't change our nature. There are the views of how wonderful this would be have gone very far. There was a report by the Department of Commerce, well, not by the Department of Commerce, there was a conference that was sponsored by the Department of Commerce of the United States government, that to which nanotechnologists and biotechnologists and computer scientists and various other kinds of people who knew about microbiology were invited. And it was about enhancing human performance. They wanted to do precisely what you're talking about. They wanted to have, for instance, soldiers who wouldn't have to sleep, They weren't always very explicit about the kinds of ideas that they had in mind, but when they talked about the benefits of all of this for industry and for the military and so on, you could read between the lines pretty clearly. Factory workers who wouldn't go on strike, maybe. This would be all very convenient. Students who didn't complain to their professors about their grades, I guess. I don't know. I think that's a horrifying world. Some people think it would be wonderful. They say this would be the next stage of human evolution. I would say no. We would be abolishing humanity if we did that. There have been attempts of other sorts. There are two companies, at least two companies that I know of, who have enucleated fertilized human eggs, human embryos, in other words, and they have taken that nucleus and put it into the enucleated egg of a sow, of a female pig. And the reason that they did this, they wanted to create what they called chimeras. That is to say, they're not man, they're not pig. They're sort of something else, some half and half. Because, you see, the laws prohibit experimentation on human subjects. And since they thought you wouldn't exactly be able to say that these were humans, right? So then you could experiment on them. And wouldn't that be wonderful for finding cures for diseases and so forth? I think this is horrifying. One writer whom I admire, who commented on this, said that he could imagine the pigmen in some future day telling their little ones, squealing there in the litter, terrible stories about what the humans did once upon a time, but who no longer exists.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I wrote down my questions so I could ask.
That's fine.
So you mentioned this conditioning of Nazi soldiers at the beginning of your lecture as an example of how we are aware of a moral law, and in order to justify wrongs, we must suppress this knowledge of morality and condition ourselves to justify our wrongdoings. I was wondering if you believe this thought is contrary to what churches teach, that we are born sinful and that we have to exert effort to be sanctified. In other words, why do parents and Sunday school teachers have to teach what is right and wrong if it is already written on our hearts?
Okay, the fact that we have some knowledge of what is right and wrong doesn't mean that we don't have to be taught everything. You remember I often use the expression, we know things dimly, right? We need to know things with greater clarity. When you were children, didn't it sometimes happen that maybe you pulled the dog's tail and mom said to you, you know better than that. Don't pull the dog's tail. How would you like it if somebody pulled your tail? Now maybe you mouthed off to your mom and said, I don't have a tail, Mom. But you know, the reason that kind of instruction works for a child is because it calls to his attention, raises to the level of awareness, makes more clear to him, confronts him with something that he really does dimly already know. The child may never have heard of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But nevertheless, there is something in us which resonates when we do hear it. Let's be conscious, okay? So that in a certain sense, you do know better than that. Now that's how moral teaching works. We need it. It reinforces, it confronts, it illuminates, it helps remove confusions. And also I've talked about what I've said, what I've described as the things that we can't not know are only the moral basics, not the details. It's quite possible not to know the details. Moral teaching also helps us to work those out. So moral teaching is very important. There's also this. You may know with perfect clarity what is right and what is wrong, and yet not do it. You need the grace of God. Yes, the questioner referred to that. You also need moral discipline. You have to practice. You have to work against your inclinations to either fear or recklessness in order to become a courageous person. You know, you have to work against your inclinations to cold harshness or to buffoonishness to become a friendly and genial and witty person. Right? It takes work. It takes work. So moral teaching is the fact that there is a law written on the heart doesn't mean that we have to obey it, that we know everything, that we don't need any moral teaching, but rather, if a law weren't written on the heart, moral teaching would never work. It would be, the seeds of moral teaching would drop on us and we'd be like stony ground. The seeds would bounce off. There would be nothing there in which they could take root. Conscience is not the fully developed plant. Conscience is that soil.
Hello, Professor. No. Sorry, that's bullshit. But
It's Budziszewski. You know, I drill my students on the first day of class. I make them say
that pass. I'm a law student here at the University of Idaho, and there's a very segment of society that I would say is somewhat uncomfortable about the idea of incorporating moral principles into laws. And I was wondering what you might respond to that, considering that from your responses to the questions, you don't believe that rejecting moral law is something that is proper to do, but how would we integrate that?
Yeah. You know, some people talk about not enforcing morality or not injecting moral principles into the law as though it were possible to have laws without morality. Tell me a law that does not reflect some moral view. I mean, there are some laws that reflect incorrect moral views, but there is no such thing as a law that does not reflect a moral view. Okay? I'm not just talking about criminal laws, the ones that punish you for murder, reflecting, for instance, the principle thou shalt not kill, or prohibiting theft, reflecting the principle thou shalt not steal, or family law, reflecting the principles like parents should take care of their children, and things of this sort, or that spouses have obligations to each other. I'm even talking to things like taxation. What is, the principle of taxation seems to be you have received benefit and you owe something in return for the benefit that you've received. The principle that you owe something for the benefits that you received is a moral principle. If people even talk about economic things like tariffs, they say, well, they say this isn't moral, this is economic. Whether you're pro-free trade or pro-tariff, you know, if you say that I want the economy to prosper, why? Because you think that it would improve people's well-being. Well, the moral principle here is that we should promote the common good. There is no such thing as a law that doesn't, that doesn't already have morality injected into it. The only choice that's between us is whether it's going to reflect a moral code clearly or badly. Maybe I should add one other thing. Sometimes people think, when I say that what I'm advocating is a kind of a moral authoritarianism, that every sin should be against the law. Okay? Well, no. The natural law tradition has always said that prudence has to be exercised. That for one thing, that sometimes when you try to do too much with law, if you try to make every sin illegal, for instance, you actually do more harm than good. And that is not moral. There are also things that are appropriate for parents to do, things that are appropriate for the church to do, things that are appropriate for the government to do, and it's not appropriate, for instance, for the government to try to do the work of the church or the work of parents. Okay, so there are some things that are off limits for the state. But is that because the state should be morally neutral? No, these principles of which things should be off limits are themselves moral principles. They are rooted in insights about what is necessary for the well-being of human beings and community.
You point out the way that our moral capacity is built into us. What would I say to a friend who were to point out people who may seem to have a different moral capacity built into them, people with certain mental disorders, sociopathy, that sort of thing?
Okay, sociopathy is a very interesting question. I can't say that I'm an authority on sociopathy, but I've delved a little bit into this literature, and I found that it certainly is true that there are some people who, when they do wrong, they never feel bad. They never feel remorse. Now, that's not really an unusual human experience. What's unusual about these people is that they're this way all the time. But probably there's no one in this room who has never, ever in his life had the experience. Haven't you all had the experience sometime in your life? I know I have. Of doing something you knew was wrong, but you didn't feel bad. I think that when we violate the moral basics, we can't escape knowing. But the feeling is something else. Sometimes it's possible to escape that feeling. And sociopaths are people who escape it all the time. They never have the feeling. Now, that's not the same as not knowing that they violated the moral law. Do you know, for instance, that sociopaths too, this is right there in the literature, they too rationalize and make excuses and justify themselves. That's a moral activity. You can only justify yourself in terms of knowledge of the moral law. People will be the psychologists who have studied sociopathy often express surprise at this. They misunderstand, many of them misunderstand what conscience is. They think that conscience is about knowledge, it's about moral knowledge, but they mistake, some of the psychologists mistakenly think that conscience is about feelings. So from the fact that these people don't have guilty feelings, they make the false inference that these people have no conscience. No, they've got a conscience. It's just that they don't have normal feelings. And that is a real disorder. It can really happen. It is going to blunt their moral capacities, but even they are not people without a conscience in the sense in which I'm using the term. I'll give you an example. This is from the newspaper, just an anecdote. Some years ago, I guess it was about 20 years ago, but I remember it. Oh yeah, okay. I'm ancient, I know. But I remember because I took note of this and I've written about this in my books, this particular essay. There was a fellow in my hometown of Austin who had killed a video rental store clerk. He was apprehended by the police. He was interviewed apparently twice in the prison by newspaper reporters. The first one said the guy doesn't have a conscience. They said that because he had no remorse. He said he didn't feel bad about what he did. That's what the police said too. They said this is a guy without a conscience. He has no conscience. Well, for some reason, the newspaper sent a second reporter out to talk to the guy. I don't know why. The second reporter, this is only a guess. I wasn't there. I wonder whether this happened because he didn't know what to ask him. He said, "You don't feel bad about what you did?" And the guy said, "No." And I imagine that maybe the reporter then must have hesitated for a long time, because into the silence the prisoner spoke. Do you know what he said? He said, "There must be something wrong with me, don't you think? Because I should feel bad for what I did." Let me tell you, if you feel bad because you don't feel bad, you've got a conscience.
Hello, Professor.
How long have you been standing there without my looking at you? Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Thank you for coming tonight. My question is actually quite related to the previous one, which is that when you were speaking earlier about how you were talking about the adaptive aspects of morality, what we might call morality, and how you were
But
feeling
what aspects?
the aspects of morality,
The aspects, okay.
the adaptive aspects, sorry. The adaptive aspects of morality.
Adaptive aspects,
Yeah,
okay.
sorry. And you were mentioning how it's different, how the feelings you have when you break morality are different from those you might feel after denying other instincts, such as food or shelter. And that sort of implies this idea that if you have a universal natural moral law, then there's going to be a universal response that you might feel toward it. And I would say, how do you, with that understanding, how do you feel about the different cultural variations of different moralities? For instance, with the slaughter of cows being horribly immoral in India, and the idea of adultery being extremely different when you live in a culture where monogamy is not the cultural norm.
Okay, I would say that let's take one of those examples. How about monogamy? It's a very good example. Now, I think that, you remember, I didn't claim that the knowledge of all the moral details is written on the heart, but just that we all really know the moral basics. You will not find a culture that doesn't recognize an institution of marriage. You will not find a culture that doesn't recognize any kinds of rules about sex and who you can find, who you can have it with, and so forth. You will not find a culture that doesn't have some recognition of the norm of faithfulness in marriage. Now, cultures may carve out certain kinds of exceptions. They may fudge the details. They may say you can have one wife, you can have 4 wives instead of 1, or something like this. Those kinds of variations are certainly present in the details, but not in the basics. It's also very interesting that even though I think because of the temptingness of polygamy for males, for most of human history, polygamy has more often been a norm than monogamy for the human race, even though I think it is demonstrable by means of the natural law that in terms of the goods that marriage serves, both the procreative good, raising children well, and the unitive good, the bond between the procreative partners and spouses, monogamy is far superior to polygamy. Okay? Monogamy is also far superior to polygamy in terms of the well-being of society as a whole, not just the family. Because, for instance, if you're going to have some men who have a whole bunch of wives, then that means that there are going to be an awful lot of other men who don't have any at all. Who are those going to be? They're going to be lower class men, and the young men are going to have to be chased out of the community. This causes social disorder. It increases resentments between the classes. And in the meantime, the order of relationships within the family itself is much more marked by distance between fathers and children, jealousy among the wives, and so forth. So perhaps it is not surprising that even though polygamy has been so widespread in the world, it is actually the ideal of monogamy is now spreading to countries where formerly it had not taken root, and women are not surprisingly finding it a sort of a liberation. Men too, sometimes, despite themselves, despite their lust. That's remarkable, I think. So I would say, sure, it's easy to be mistaken or to get it wrong or to have cultural variability in the details, but there are certain norms. There is something special about marriage, special about the bond between one man and one woman. It is recognized everywhere. Do you know of any culture anywhere in the world that has love poetry that is completely polyamorous, where Fred, Mary, and Sam write to their beloved Sally, John, and Frank? No, that would be recognized as farce anywhere in the world. Always it is the lover who speaks to the beloved. Even in, for instance, the Song of Songs, which is a great erotic poem in the Old Testament, there was polygamy in the Old Testament. Okay, and yet even there, it is the lover and the beloved speaking to each other, just the two.
I think you've already spoken to it a little bit, but I just had some questions about maybe the way that we try and make laws just of countries, etc., to try and appease our conscience or think that it won't matter what we do after that. For example, some of the laws about drug use or of sexuality, kind of the situation that was just in the news. I don't know tons about it, but some of our men go to Colombia, hooking up with hookers, etc., down there. And in Colombia, obviously, hookers are illegal, but then everyone was still outraged that, our people shouldn't have been doing that, but that was the law of that country. But it still kind of shows some kind of moral outrage that you really shouldn't have been doing that, even if it was legal or whatnot, or we had an offense about that. Or it could be extrapolated to drug use and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah,
because
so what is the question?
I guess it's just that we are trying to legislate that kind of thing, and how do you comment on that? Like, thinking that it would make it okay by making laws about that.
Basically, you're asking me to comment on the effort to make something okay.
Appease our conscience by changing those kind of things, But then
we
still
sure. It happens. We do appease our consciences sometimes by trying to make laws. Sometimes we even make foolish and utopian laws to try to achieve moral ends that might be good in themselves, but are probably unattainable by law in order to make ourselves feel better. That might have been one of the impulses in Prohibition, for instance. I think Prohibition was a foolish law. but it made people feel very self-righteous. You know, it was a form of the progressivism of the time. It seemed ethical to people. They could feel like they were doing a favor to the poor because they looked down at them and figured that drunkenness was a bigger problem with them than with other people. Sure, there's a lot of that kind of thing. There's also displacement. I wonder sometimes, for instance, look, I believe in being kind to animals. I don't believe in cruelty to animals. But I wonder how much of what is called the animal rights campaign has to do with attempts to appease our consciences about abortion. I saw an automobile in Austin that said on one sticker something like "Save the baby rabbits." It was against experimentation by cosmetic companies, putting that stuff in their eyes, which is very horrible. But on the other bumper sticker it said, "I'm pro-choice and I vote." Okay, I wonder, how much of this is passing laws in order to make ourselves feel better. And sure, we do that, and we do these things. We do irrational things and wrong things to make ourselves feel better, not only in the law, but in private life as well. And so I guess I agree. I don't know what else I can say about that. Hello.
Hi. Well, you were speaking about monogamous relationships, and you were focusing on marriage. And then earlier it was mentioned that you wrote a book on the meaning of sex.
Yes.
And I was just wondering more specifically.
Which everybody should read.
And I was just wondering more specifically on where's the morality, in natural law, with premarital sexual relations before marriage. Why should we wait? Is that a natural law?
Yeah, I do think so. Here's why. I think faithfulness of the spouses is even more important. But yes, I think that we are hurting ourselves if we exercise sexual intercourse outside of marriage or before marriage in any way. Let's think. There are several ways that you can think about it. One way to begin is this: just like I can ask, what is the purpose of the eyes? Well, it's to see. What is the purpose of the heart? It's to pump blood. What is the purpose of the capacity for anger? It is to arouse me to the protection of endangered goods. What is the purpose of the intelligence? To be able to deliberate well about what to do, and to be able to attain the truth, especially about the most important things, like the truth about God. What is the purpose of sex? Now that's interesting. I can ask my students all kinds of things. What's the purpose of taking a deep breath? And they'll say to oxygenate the blood. What's the purpose? They'll give me all these very sophisticated. They recognize it immediately what the purpose is, and I'll say, what's the purpose of the sexual powers? And they'll say, well, pleasure. Well, now wait a minute. It's pleasurable to stretch your arm. But that's not the purpose of the muscle. It's pleasurable to take a deep breath, but that's not the purpose of that. It's pleasurable to eat. And it's fine if you're eating in a way that brings nutrition, so you take pleasure in it. Right? There'd be something wrong if you didn't. But the purpose of it is nutrition, and you shouldn't eat in a way that undermines nutrition or harms you nutritionally, right? In the same way, the purpose of sex, of course, it's pleasurable. The exercise of every voluntary power is pleasurable. But you have to look at the purpose of sex, which isn't pleasure, in order to know which are the right ways of enjoying that pleasure and which are the wrong ways. Now, when people think about it this way, it doesn't take very long to realize that sex, you can ask, why do we even have sexual powers? Any biologist knows that this is connected with procreation, which, by the way, in the way that a natural lawyer thinks about it, is not just about having kids, it's about raising them well. It's about making families. Now, sex also has a second purpose, a second function, which is tied in with the first and can't be separated from it. And that is that it unites the two procreative partners, the mom and the dad. And these things work together because the child needs a mom and needs a dad. Okay? Now, consider when you have the You have the procreative good, let's call it that, that's the traditional name, and the unitive good. Can those goods, my argument about polygamy earlier amounted to saying, polygamy does not serve the procreative good as well. It isn't as good for the child. It doesn't serve the unitive good as well. There's jealousy among the spouses and so forth. Okay? And that in turn hurts the child too. The same is true of premarital sexuality. The child might not even ever know who his father is. And even if you had some perfect means of birth control that worked magically and automatically, you're losing the opportunity for that unique, irreplaceable, special form of love and intimacy, which can exist only between two partners who give themselves entirely to each other and to no one else or life. So yeah, that is a matter of the natural law. I think that's beautiful, and I am surprised that we should think that it's something joy-killing. Nobody else? That one scared everyone away. that joy killer.
So I actually have one more question. I think we have time.
Okay.
Do you have energy for one more?
Do I have what?
Energy for one more.
Sure, yes. I won't crash until significantly after this. I'm running out of adrenaline.
So you mentioned earlier in one of your responses that the moral law that we can't not know is the moral basics. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But the details are not as obvious. They take working out.
They take working out. Yeah, natural lawyers have traditionally called those the remote implications of the general principles.
And so I wonder, a few of the questions have sort of observed or remarked on cultural variation and that sort of thing. So I wonder if, from your perspective in the natural law, whether there's a possibility of something like a reasonable pluralism in the details, right? So in other words, the basics are all squared away, but that in different cultures, the details get worked out in different ways.
Well, in some things, I think that's a good thing, and some things not. You see that even in manners. It is a fundamental about manners, for instance, that we should express courtesy to each other. We should have ways of conducting ourselves to each other which facilitate and sort of lubricate social life, that where we are able to we're able to express gratitude to each other. But on the other hand, if one culture does all of those things in this way, that when somebody has treated you to a good meal, you say thank you. That was really delicious. I appreciate your graciousness. And in another culture, they do it by belching loudly to show how well it agreed with them, and throwing the chicken bones over their shoulder. It seems that a reasonable pluralism about cultural practices like that is certainly possible. On the other hand, you can easily find some forms of manners that work against those goods, that work against the purposes of manners. For instance, people might in some culture just shut each other out of the way when they're getting into the bus, or not wait for people to get out of the elevator before they get in. And then I think to say, well, let's have a pluralism about and about rude people and polite people becomes foolish. Now, I would say it's the same thing with morality. Certain practices of courtship, for instance. Do you ask for the permission of the father? How long do you have what's called an engagement? Do you get pinned? Do you do this? There are all kinds of cultural things that can vary, right? But on the other hand, something like, well, are you going to be faithful to your spouse? That seems to be something where there is no reason to entertain variation. Right, where there is no reason why variation would be a good idea. And when I say not to entertain it, I don't mean that you go into the armies and suppress people who are doing it differently. I think you should try to persuade them. But I think that there are modes of diversity that are good for us, and there are modes that are bad for us. Another way to put it is this way: think about this. Let me draw an analogy with music. This is not original. It's wonderful that there are so many different kinds and styles and genres of music. There is classical music, and there's folk music, and there's Gregorian chant, and there are symphonies, and there are quick songs. But you know what makes all of them possible is an understanding of principles like rhythm and harmony. Rhythm, if you think, oh, don't weigh me down with rhythm and harmony. Don't tell me that we have to be the same about these kinds of things. You're stifling my creativity. No, you're not stifling your creativity. You're making creativity possible. Because if you ignore rhythm and harmony, you don't have a diversity of melody anymore. You just have noise. You have the extermination of music rather than the facilitation of it. And in the same way, I would say that there needs to be an agreement about the moral basics. But some things, like whether you drive on the right or the left, might be things that can certainly vary in different places.
Okay, this seems like a good question.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.